Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ujan Sarkar, and on the behalf of the International Law and Policy Society of National Law University, Odisha, I would like to invite all of you to the first episode of our flagship podcast, Borders and Beyond. We have with us Dr. Deborshi Barat, who is the head of public policy and knowledge management in SNR Associates. He is an expert in data privacy, ESG, AI, and the regulatory sector. And today we'd like to discuss with him and share his expertise with all of you regarding the regulatory sector and international trade specifically. Sir had written an article on India's export outlook in light of US tariffs, and that had specifically caught our eye. And we wanted to discuss this article further, and more importantly, the developments in international law and the international policy space, and get Sir's insightful opinions on it. And we hope this would be a meaningful episode for you as well. Um, Good afternoon, sir. It's great to have you here. And we could start with the questions whenever you're ready.
Sure. Good afternoon, Ujan, and thank you so much for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Natalie?
Good afternoon, sir. Great to have you here. So our first question is, if you could just briefly explain the rationale behind this 25% tariffs, as it not only affects India-US trade, but also global trade at large.
Yeah. We know the long story, right? It's unfolding as we speak, and it'll probably get worse and different over the next few weeks. But the thing also to remember is that on the one hand, it is not an India-specific issue. It's the US trade policy reorientation in the first place, especially after President Trump assumed office beginning of this year. And the other thing is, in the last few weeks, um, it's taken an ugly turn for India. Uh, if you remember, and all of you do because you follow this space, um, it wasn't so bleak, it wasn't so skewed vis-a-vis India uh, earlier this year, even when the adverse trade policy announcements were getting announced. So, declaration of some kind of a national emergency, acknowledgement of major trade deficit, acknowledgement of struggling US domestic industries, that happened soon after President Trump assumed office in January 2025. Then the discussions just were about US Mexico, which is obviously very relevant for the US ecosystem, and China, again very relevant to the US you know hegemonic plans, grand strategy, etc. Great power struggle. But then it became all encompassing, with the Liberation Day announcements in April, even before that. And I think uh, just to feed off your question, Nadine, the thing is, right now, in my book, the biggest problem is not what is happening and this reorientation, to the extent that the world has become accustomed to a different world order, different trade dynamic. But it's the constant and chronic uncertainty. At a given point of time, you don't know what's going to be the rate, what other sector will be impacted, uh, and the all of government attack, whether you deploying some other political apparatus tactic to sort of negotiate a better trade deal, whether it's because of, I don't know, some kind of sanctions related issue, or whether it's about students coming and visas or workers coming. So, you are exposed and vulnerable in terms of, the impact on all fronts. So it's not a sector specific issue anymore, nor even, if you think about it, just a trade specific issue. It's happening across the board. So yeah, I mean, you said 25%, right? But now India is like, I wish it were 25% as opposed to 50%. So that's where we are at.
Yeah. So as you rightly mentioned, the long-term implications is this not only on industries, we also have it on employment and students and exports as well. So India as well is threatening reciprocal tariffs. So are we witnessing a prolonged trade battle, and how is this going to impact us as such?
So if you ask me, obviously it's a bit of crystal ball gazing, right? We don't know. But what eventually will happen? I would be very surprised if India enters into a very tit for tat battle with the US. India is not China. India doesn't have the same leverage as China has. Um, the US is not dependent on Indian imports. Uh, a large cross section of consumption of Indian goods that are consumed in the US are attributable to Indian diaspora, which obviously the US political apparatus will not care about. The administration is agnostic about it. China has leverage, and which it already has exercised. The other thing is, even if the imports are important, Indian imports to the US are important, there are alternative geographies, and the US is already looking at it. China has also used this vis-a-vis the US in terms of soy, and China has pivoted away to Brazil, which, according to some commentators, is part of the reason why, other than his political alliances, um, is why, and the wider BRICS piece, why President Trump has been targeting Brazil, because that market was very lucrative. It was huge, and China was the biggest consumer of U.S. soy, and it has completely moved away to Brazil. Um, so so I don't know whether there's the the US remains and has remained for a long time India's biggest trading partner. Other than very obvious reasons over the last couple of decades about a growing relationship, political, diplomatic, with the US. Very obviously because we are in a uh, dangerous neighborhood in terms of political alliances. We are hemmed in by neighbors which we cannot rely on. So whether it's a quad kind of a situation, uh, it's economic, diplomatic, political, security, defense oriented, India has to be in alignment with uh, some major power, and the US was obviously a partner, and now that is teetering on the brink of volatility, uncertainty, which is why at the SCO summit, obviously it's you can argue that it's optics, but perceptions have a large part to do with it, and it was seen by whoever was meant to see, and President Trump also acknowledged it. So Prime Minister Modi tried to show that it's not about his relationship with China or Russia. It's about India's openness to you know diversify the buffet, basically. Like, we have other options. uh, if the US is not able to absorb our goods, if the US makes our export focused sectors uncompetitive, we will look at LATAM, we will look at Russia. uh, but the thing is, I don't know whether other geographies have the same absorption power. So, moving away from the US, it's all right to want to foster more South-South relations. It doesn't even have to be South-South per se. And we are exploring the EU, for example, and other geographies, Southeast Asia, the big economies of Southeast Asia, whether it's Japan or Korea. But the thing is, Indian exporters which were focused on the US, whether it's shrimp or gems and jewelry or textiles or whatever, that market cannot be replaced, definitely not anytime soon, or overnight. And over the long run, even then, it's debatable. So if we're looking at a very long term horizon, yeah, then who knows, over 10, 20 years. But that's a long time, right? So as I was saying, mm, to basically demonstrate that India is not wholly reliant on US imports of Indian exporter products and services, to show that we have other options is one thing. But to get into a prolonged trade war, an escalation, I don't think India is looking at it, and I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it is highly possible in terms of the resources available. Um, so it'll probably be, I'm not saying that means that India has to take everything lying down. Obviously, that's not also what's happening, but it'll be a mixture somewhere in the middle, and it's an evolving piece. So yeah.
So, sir, as you spoke about it, that India's reliance on US exports is massive. So, to cushion the blow, how does policies like Atmanirbhar Bharat, which we have been pushing for quite a while now, come into play? And if other countries as well take up these protectionist policies that we're seeing that US is taking up right now, how does it impact the global trade system as a whole?
Yeah, it's obviously not great news for the global trade system, like you said. And but we didn't start the fire, so we're just responding to the dynamic, right? And other countries also having to do that. Uh, I think it'll probably be a good thing over the long term. This is the most hopeful outcome, and it's my personal opinion that over maybe a 10-20 year period, um, trading patterns will change significantly. Of course, we sometimes forget that these geopolitical alliances are not set in stone. Like India's relationship with Canada has gone through a reorientation in the recent past, right now, after Trudeau vacated office. And that was a minor blip, that period. So President Trump is here for some time. In the future, things may come back to some sort of a normal that we are used to. But this marks the beginning, perhaps, of a period of volatility and reorientations. So, I mean, I think that's where we are at. And we'll have to see how the dynamic evolves. So you try to wean yourself away from, reliance on the US market in terms of selling your goods and services. So Atmanirbhar Bharat has been anyway very important for India's grand strategy. The great thing about India, even vis-a-vis China today, is that not only do we have a huge domestic market, the domestic market is able to absorb a lot of the external geopolitical shocks and risks, macroeconomic, volatility. And this has stood India in good stead in the past as well. It is what it is. I'm not saying it is, been built up over the years systematically and strategically. It is what it is, and that's great news for India. China, which has increasingly focused on exports to expand its economic footprint, its influence, has a bigger blow to face. And domestic consumption in China has, depleted over the last few years. Uh, the Chinese economy has also been retracting. The Chinese government, the party, has been trying to spur a domestic consumption in various important sectors. The housing crisis has been ongoing for a while. India has not faced any of those issues so far. And let's see how long these clean macroeconomic fundamentals, which remain good for India, go on in the future. I'm not saying this is necessarily reason to be complacent about it, but uh, ultimately, see, it's one thing to say that you try to produce locally, your supply chains should be as localized as possible. Um, so that we produce, we consume ourselves, so it doesn't matter whether there's another war in some other sensitive geography, we won't get very adversely affected. But it is a globalized world. It's one thing to push it as an ideal, and that's partly political, partly ideological after a point, and it's okay wherever the chips fall. But it's another thing that just mainstream microeconomics, like specialization does play a part in the way things work. So completely avoiding and moving away from trade and the neoliberal consensus is like a dangerous uh, call for the future. So I don't know what that'll be.
So very interestingly, because you specified so importantly why the situation is very uncertain, why it's so volatile, and how it has potential to, let's say, if countries don't react efficiently, to lead to stopping of global trade. This is exactly why we have legal safeguards and the WTO and similar legal frameworks in the first place. We want to ask you, like, because the specific section used in WTO, which is Article 21 of the GATT, it allows parties to take any action it considers necessary for its essential security interests. And because there's an exception which comes in wherein you can take any action in times of war or other international relations. What we wanted to ask you was, when the United States uses Section 232 of its Trade Expansion Act, does this fall under the ambit of other international relations? Because a lot of these tariffs were essentially um, because India had acted in a certain way in terms of its relations with Russia. So, does this legally allow countries to impose tariffs on other countries and take such protectionist measures?
Yeah, I mean, that's so ultimately it comes down to interpretation, right? And which body at which time, whether it can be appealed. So this is there's a lot to say and think about on this question, and this is a great question, right? But in all bluntness, I think it can be summarized thus. Firstly, it's a situation of lawfare. You figure out what is the best way you can push forth a political agenda, political economic agenda. So earlier, Section 301 was used of the Trade Act. Now, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act was being used for US, Mexico, China, including India, in terms of national security concerns, as you pointed out. Now, a lot of the reciprocal tariffs legal authority is being generated from the IEP, and that I mean the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Federal Circuit in Washington D.C. recently said that you know it's 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 not cool. So now the U.S. Supreme Court will hear that in October, November. Something may happen. President Trump seems to think that because of the Republican majority of the bench, this will pass through, and we don't need to get into the marriage, the unholy marriage between politics and judicial interpretation. But even if something adverse comes out, which sort of surprises the administration, uh, announcements suggest that there are plan Bs and plan Cs. They will adopt a different legal route to push forth the same agenda. So I don't even know whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act per se will be hit by GATT Article 21. Section 232 remains debatable, arguable. Um, but the other thing, Ujan, is that the WTO is not efficient. Enforcement takes a lot of time. The US may not agree. It will take X number of months to have any clarity. So I think ultimately what might happen is that some coalition of aggrieved nations might come together and try to come forth, whether using the GATT and the WTO framework. The US has been historically opposed to dispute resolution under the WTO for a long time. The appellate structure has been in a shambles for a while. So I mean, the multilateral order in itself is in question. Yes, it is holding stuff together. It gives a basic format, a blueprint for things to go forward. But as India has also acknowledged over the last few years now, like we are moving to a situation, a global environment where increasingly you're securing your trade relationships not through a global consensus, but through binary relationships, through signing of FTAs, bilateral FTAs, or even like regional plurilateral FTAs. And India has been actively, which is why India has been pushing for the EU now. The UK was done recently, and others. So, I mean, that's going to be the step forward. And which is why, I mean, it's unfortunate that India was one of the first movers of this bilateral free trade agreement with the US. And then everything, blew up in smoke. And the ones who started negotiating with the US later, after we started, went ahead and got their deals done. And their tariff rates were reduced, and India missed that bus. And I'm not saying the other countries are smarter or they are luckier or they were right and India was wrong. A lot of the things that countries agreed to were not very comfortable. Look at even the big economies of Asia. Korea has been saying, no, we can't invest that much. Japan has made commitments to invest a huge amount of money in the US. India does not have such deep pockets in the first place. And the red flags which India has raised and which are reportedly holding up the negotiations. I don't know how that will get resolved, whether it's agriculture, whether it's dairy. Uh, I don't know. I mean, maybe India can see if we can make a few concessions which are not superbly critical. So India is playing a two-level game, right? India has to take care of its own interest, its domestic constituents, at the same time make meet the US halfway. And in the middle of a lot of noise, someone will say something nasty or dirty about India, and India has to respond. So in that hostile environment, and I mean, these things may sound childish, but these things are true. The negotiations are taking place uh, in a sort of echo chamber of noise and hostility, and you have to make sure, okay, on the one hand, the US is still a very important partner of India in terms of technology, in terms of security, in terms of defense. So you can't walk away from that. And these are critical existential issues for India, especially because India is in the neighborhood that it is in, with Bangladesh going south, with Pakistan, with China. You have to have a major ally. And Russia has relationship with China and Pakistan as well. So yes, you continue with your relationship with Russia, whether in terms of defense purchases, oil purchases, and the oil purchase from Russia was also contingent upon India's economic needs and global needs as well. India is a developing country. You cannot forget that fact. Uh, so to that extent, yeah, I mean that's where the pieces are. Sorry, I'll wait for your next question, Ajan.
No, so that was a very comprehensive answer because while there exist appellate mechanisms and the WTO mechanism does allow for an appeal, and I think this was evidenced in the Russia-Ukraine cases where Russia had imposed tariffs and the WTO did allow to review the possibility of probably extending outside of Article 21, which is why you have Article 21 of the GATT, which is why you have WTO courts in the first place while you did specify on how the US
Right.
has unholy marriage in your words between the judiciary and the political parties, which is why it's probably unfair to have the domestic courts looking at it in the first place. But we're also very intrigued about your thoughts in terms of how India moves forward and how it looks at its own people um, and domestic obligations while ensuring you develop further trade. Mundra, do you have anything to add on this?
Right. So, sir, as you said before as well, that US is a market which is not replaceable inherently, but also that India needs to take into regard its domestic constituencies. We have also seen that because of the inherent impositions, the Southeast Asia trade routes and market is something that has been directly impacted. Do you see India taking up a stance or taking up a position here after this tariff imposition from US? And if India does so, how does it manage a WTO compliance as well as its internal domestic market? How does India go forward with it then?
No, so sorry, Aditya, I didn't get your point about the Southeast Asia pivot. What was the
Right.
exact
So,
point about it?
right, so what I wanted to say was ki, in Southeast Asia, because of the tariff imposition of US, a lot of countries have suffered, not only India, and especially the political context is there. So India does need to safeguard its domestic constituencies, but India also right now has an opportunity to go ahead and then make a place for itself as well in the Southeast Asian markets and trade routes, especially with the entire political tussle regarding South China Sea and Bangladesh and everything. So, does India take up that opportunity, or does India completely focus on, let's say, domestic protection first?
So, Aditya, the other thing, like to go back to what I was saying originally, if you just take a walk back and how the journey unfolded over the last few months. So, at one point in time, with in the Rose Garden when President Trump was showing off the tariffs, 27%, 26% for India, and some of the Southeast Asian economies, including those which are directly competitive with India in terms of the products, like Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh for textiles, etc. They had high tariffs. So at that point in time, the mood was that, yeah, not only is India negotiating bilateral trade agreement and we are an early mover, so we won't be that affected. It is bad for everybody, including us. But relatively speaking, India is better off because look at China; they have 34% plus pre-existing X percent, so it's coming to 54%. Look at Vietnam, 46%. Look at Bangladesh, 37, 38%, whatever, and we are just 26, 27. So we'll be okay. Uh, it might even benefit India. So President Trump is a blessing in disguise. Then things took an ugly turn over the next few weeks and months. In terms of what India can do to utilize opportunities, I don't know, discover opportunities even in moments of crises. I mean, we can talk about it, but the thing is, things have to stabilize somewhere. Right now, it is constantly a moving piece. So, whether our supply chains need to change, which geographies we align ourselves with in the future, India has already been looking at not just Southeast Asia, but say, for example, Southeast Asia has been uh, particularly focused by the Indian defense sector for exporting our defense products. So, indigenous defense production has gone up exponentially in the last few years, and the Indian government wants to ramp up further. However, technology is the missing and weak piece. So India still is reliant on sophisticated technology, whether from Israel, Russia, increasingly the US as well. Going forward, the US India defense collaboration may go through various interesting changes. On the one hand, India may be forced to align itself to ramp up purchases beyond what it originally wanted to. At the same time, this environment of uncertainty and hostility is also putting a strain, which is why India will definitely not move away from France or even Russia, for example, because Russia has been a more reliable partner that way, as far as India is concerned. In terms of oil purchases and how that goes on, I think India will not be. So India has made demands like, okay, allow us to, buy crude from some of the other sanctioned countries like Iraq. But there are sanctions there as well. So who do we buy oil from? Only you. So that's where we're at in terms of trying to discover supply chains uh, and trying to focus and build further on the China plus one strategy. I don't know whether India, at one point in time, a few months back, it looked like India can leverage this opportunity. Right now, I'm not sure. So whether India should sign the RCEP, which was under discussion and negotiation for a long time, and then India thought that okay, agriculture is a sensitive sector, so we can't, you know, go down that rabbit hole. Uh, but perhaps this is the time to for India to think about these other relationships which were not as pivotal or important, depend and subject to domestic sensitivities. But with this situation, uh, the US is like any other partner or any other country now for India. Yes, you rely on the US for uh, maybe defense, maybe technology, especially technology, but you cannot depend on the US for other things. It's not your ally as such. So President Trump has made this transactional nature of trade, politics, diplomacy out front and center. And I think India has to follow suit. India is forced to follow suit. I mean, India is not alone here. Even Europe uh, is having to follow that path. So,
I think that was
Right.
a wonderful. Yeah, I think so. That was a wonderful answer to like wrap up our whole conversation because not only did that give us an insight on how um trade is not just a legal concept and international trade law can't be looked at in isolation, but it has to be looked at in terms of politics as well, in terms of how you want to build alliances and how other countries are reacting to such state policies, and how these policies are also not fixed in time. And with different leaders in different countries, you have different reactions. And these reactions allow you to make strategic decisions in terms of what trading block you want to join and what trading block is essentially important for specific parts of your domestic sector as well. Because we are short on time and we would like to wrap it up at this point, we would like to thank you immensely for your insights with regards to this topic, because not only was this extremely informative in terms of how law works, but we also got to see essentially what India can do in the future and what remain the question marks for India, which it has to take off in order to solidify its policy or take a stronger stance, which would be beneficial for it. It was also extremely informative in understanding how the legal framework works, because we as law students often end up just studying the law without understanding its practical implications. And because law is not always set in stone, it is a free flowing, dynamic concept as well, which is why it was an extremely important conversation to have with you as well. Um, Thank you so much for coming with us, sir, and it was a pleasure to talk with you.
thank you so much, Ujan. And that was an excellent summary, by the way. Yeah. So, thank you all, Naidile, Aditya, and Ujan, of course.
Thank you so much, sir.
Um, yeah,
Thank you so much, sir. We'd love to have you back working with ILPS in some or the other sort. You have always been very hospitable in working with NLU also, and we'd love to carry forward this relationship with the International Law and Policy Society as well. Thank you so
sure.
much.
Would love to. Thank you. Thank you.